some ways this is my favorite topic in the class because of the transitional nature of Theseus. How important he is as a kind of bridge between myth and history. As you already gleaned from that second day that we had, where we spent an entire day looking at Greek history, an overview of it, today some of that stuff that we talked about on that day will ring bells about some of the things we talked about then. Because these next two pre-Homeric heroes, don't forget, that's our trajectory. We're going to end up with Homer. We dealt with Perseus and Heracles. Now we do Theseus and Jason. And unlike Perseus and Heracles, where you'll remember, I didn't get much into history. I talked about, Perseus founded Mycenae, and that was a giantly important thing for Mycenaean civilization, even nominally so, right? Because it's named after Mycenae. And so you want to definitely associate, even by name, Perseus with Mycenaean civilization. And then as far as Heracles goes, he's all over the place because he's the most important hero. He's the heroic Zeus, so to speak. He's the Zeus of the heroes. He's worshipped everywhere, not only geographically, but also chronologically throughout Greek history from the very beginning. So Heracles, he's the all-purpose hero. When we talk about Theseus, we can situate him more than any of the four pre-Homeric heroes in a historical moment. Okay, so one thing I want to do is give you a foreshadowing, or what's called a spoiler in our time, that the next hero, Jason, is going to be just as, if not more, important to the Hellenistic period as Theseus is to the classical period. So definitely you're going to want to associate Theseus with the classical period, for reasons we'll get into today, and then you want to associate Jason with the Hellenistic period. And interestingly, there are two completely different reasons why we're going to be associating these two heroes with these two different periods. Okay? So, because we have that overview that we did, like I said, a lot will ring a bell today. Because we're going to kind of backtrack historically, leading up to when Theseus enters the picture, and you're going to see how important he is as that transitional figure between myth and history. And then Jason's a whole other story. Okay, we'll get to him later. So what you need to do is you need to, first of all, remember Homer standing at the beginning of the Archaic period, as we talked about, and the Iliad and the Odyssey. I have 800 for the beginning of the Archaic. 750 BC this is all BC. 750 BC is the date normally given for the Homeric epics first being sung to the Greeks. And so you remember him because, first of all, he was beyond a religious text for the Greeks in the sense that he bridged the religious and the secular in a way that isn't done with religious texts, at least to that extent. And so he was the most important literary figure by far, or in his case, verbal narrative figure, because it was oral poetry, in all of Greece. But also it's important because the subject matter that he sang about, as you remember, was the Trojan War, which is the war that occurred in the Mycenaean period. So he's the guy that we're going to end this class with. So if that's the case, what's going on here? Why are we holding off on Homer until the end? The reason is that we need to make a distinction between when Theseus as a mythical figure did what he did and when his story began to really make its rounds in Greece. As far as the figure goes, he preceded the heroes of the Trojan War as far as what he did. And an easy way to think of it is he's a contemporary with Heracles. Okay, so boom, hopefully that clicked for you. Okay, because Heracles, remember, is the great-grandson of Perseus. So it's just a matter of situating them and realizing that the Trojan War comes after Heracles, and so it comes after Theseus. So that's why we're dealing with Theseus before we get into Homer. Not because Theseus' story became most widespread before Homer began to sing his epics, because it didn't, okay, it came after, but because of when the figures themselves were sung about. So that's my bias in this class, is focusing on the heroes themselves and when they did the exploits they were famous for in terms of the order in which they're presented in the class. So what you need to do is you need to think of Theseus, you need to think of Jason coming next, and Heracles, all as contemporaries. They all lived at the same time, as illustrated by the voyage of the Argonauts that we talk about in connection with Jason. Okay, Jason and the voyage of the Argonauts. They all went together on their Avengers journey, on their Avengers hero quest. Okay, Avengers, direct, whatever you want to call it, borrowing / ripoff from the story of those three heroes, and among others as well, who went on the voyage of the Argo that we're going to talk about next time. Theseus is a really interesting case. Whereas Perseus is the first of the Greek heroes, not the most important, because that's the next guy. And he is a Pan-Hellenic, which is an ancient Greek word for all Greek hero, just like Heracles is. Okay, so Perseus and his quest and eventual success at killing Medusa was an all-Greek or Pan-Hellenic achievement that symbolized the heroism that all Greeks were supposed to identify with in the figure of Perseus. Heracles is the same situation. Heracles is also Pan-Hellenic, and even more so. So he is not the first of the heroes, he's by far the most important of all the heroes. So now where does Theseus fit in? Theseus is modeled on Heracles directly. And I told you guys last time, kind of a cliffhanger, that Theseus is the Mini-Heracles. Think definitely of the James Bond parody movies by Mike Meyer, Mini-Me, all right? Theseus is Mini-Heracles in that sense. The idea, first of all, let's just start with the most obvious, 6 labors instead of 12. So what the heck's going on? Why would that be? Very important reason. And by the way, try to find it anywhere. No one talks about it. No one cares about it. I don't know why. It's a giant thing. It's a very important thing. And so we're going to talk today about why it is that Theseus was considered to be a Mini-Heracles, and the historical setting for the hero will make it very clear. Okay? So Homer stands at the beginning of the Archaic period. He's singing about the Trojan War. And from the beginning of the Archaic period leading up to the beginning of the Classical period, initiated by the beginning of the Persian Wars between Greece and the Persian Empire, that is the beginning of the Classical period. And because the Athenians were by far the most crucial factor in the Greek victory over the Persian Empire in the Persian Wars, Athens became known as pretty much the protector of the rest of the Greeks, or at least projected themselves as such. Okay, they after the Persian Wars, which lasted about 11 years, so started in 490 and ended in 479, the Greeks ended up winning after 3 major battles, including Thermopylae, immortalized in the story that they did the movie 300 for. Before that, it was Marathon, and after that, it was Salamis. Because of the Battle of Salamis, the Athenians got the most credit for beating the Persian Empire, mainly because there was a general who was almost exclusively instrumental in convincing the Athenians to build up the most powerful fleet, in other words, ships for fighting, of anywhere in the world. And it was at sea that Athens became most prominent. Later on, near the end of the Classical period, when the Athenians fought against the Spartans, once the Spartans became impatient with the Athenians for pretty much lording it over everybody else and claiming that they're the most important, when the Spartans knew damn well, and it was true, that they were the most formidable fighters on land of any of the Greeks. Okay, it was all about sea versus land. Athenians were most prominent at sea, and the Spartans by land. And Spartans knew that the Athenians knew it, and it eventually turned into a war, a civil war. Okay, and I also pointed out that there are interesting, almost eerie similarities between ancient Greek history and early U.S. history, because we had the Revolutionary War and then eventually the Civil War. Okay, and that's exactly what happened with Greece. So once the Persian Wars were over in the favor of the Greeks, the Athenians wanted the rest of the Greeks to believe, okay, whether or not it was true, the Athenians did all they could to convince the rest of the Greeks that they were so much more important as protectors of the future of Greece than any other polis, including Sparta, which Sparta disagreed with, that they went out of their way in various ways to, in some ways symbolically, other ways propagandistically, to build up certain institutions and customs that symbolize how much greater Athens was than everyone else. One of those was the theater of Dionysus. Okay, so the very buildup of theater itself. And we talked about theater in connection with Dionysus and all that. And so this is where you should place theater. When we talked about Pericles and his responsibility for sponsoring theater in Athens, this is where you need to think of it, right after the Persian Wars. Also, don't forget the Delian League. The Delian League, the club that Pericles, the general, who pretty much ruled out, even though it was a democracy with quotes around it, he had the most backing militarily, and so he was the guy who got to be at least symbolically considered the leader of the Athenians. And Pericles was behind the supporting of not only the theater of Dionysus that we talked about, but also the dramatic festival, the Panathenaic festival, the all-Athenian festival that we talked about. Okay? And so, as we said, every single year after the Persian Wars, the Greeks from all over, the Polis, from all over Greece, were, invited, really forced to come to Athens in order to pay tribute to the treasury of the Delian League. And once they were there, kind of the frosting on the cake was to be able to be in the audience of the dramatic festivals that were taking place at the Theater of Dionysus that we talked about. Okay, so that's to situate the stuff that we brought up regarding tragedy and comedy, drama in general, and theater in general. So that was one way that Pericles tried to kind of symbolize how much greater Athens was than everyone else. But then there was another way, a way that will sound familiar to you because of that day that we spent on Egypt. And remember the Heliopolis creation myth, in which Narmer, whether he came up with the story or not, probably didn't. He definitely was the guy who propagated it throughout Egypt in order to convince the Egyptians, north and south, to unify. Okay, and so symbolically, the winner, for want of a better word, of the Heliopolis creation myth happened to be the god that Narmer's settlement worshipped. And so the symbolism was, hey, in this story, look who won, and so guess who are the ones who are going to rule this whole unification process. Okay? Very Pericles-like in the sense of taking control and doing all he could to convince everybody that he was the right guy for the job. But he didn't create theater. He didn't create drama. Narmer didn't in Egypt, okay? That's what Pericles did. But another thing Pericles did, and not just Pericles, but other generals who preceded him and followed him, just like the Heliopolis creation myth with Narmer, so the story of Theseus, the hero, was for Pericles in Athens the equivalent to the Heliopolis creation myth for Narmer in Egypt. So what Narmer did with that story to try to convince everybody to unify in Egypt, so the Athenians, after the Persian War, propagated the Theseus myth all over Greece in order to corroborate this idea that the Athenians were the justified champions of all of the other polis in Greece. Now, by the way, why is it important to do that? Oh, let me think. Because if you don't successfully do that, there's a thing called beyond war. If all of the polis didn't buy into this idea of the Delian League and Athens being at the head of it, they could easily destroy Athens. You know what I'm saying? So it required propaganda to the nth degree to convince everybody that it was in their best interest for Athens to be healthy, to be a healthy polis, to be strong, and to lead everybody else. Okay? And Theseus was the figurehead, right? The symbolic figurehead of that project by Pericles. So the question is, how the heck did the Athenians manage to create, or at least propagate, just like with Narmer, we don't know who exactly came up with this stuff, the story of Theseus? What was it about this myth? And I give you little hints of it in the book, but we'll get more into it today. What was it about the Theseus myth that was so appropriate for creating this kind of propagandistic energy throughout the rest of Greece? And how did they manage to do it? What were the aspects of the story where that happened? So the real hint here is that it's not only a matter of Theseus being a great hero and having something to do with Athens itself, it's also a story about Theseus symbolically conquering the previous kid on the block in Greece. Okay? The previous Athens, if you will. And who that was the island of Crete, Minoan civilization here at the very beginning. So what there's going to be a story of, think about it, Theseus living in the Mycenaean period, conquering the king of the center of Minoan civilization, right? So very symbolically, you have this king on the island of Crete in Minoan civilization, starting out as a good guy, and then becoming corrupted and being a bad guy, and then Theseus conquering him and his civilization, okay, as a symbol for what Athens could do to the rest of Greece if they needed to. Okay, that's kind of the idea. So the place to start with the beginning of Theseus, and what we're going to do from the very outset is we're going to compare and this is kind of a spoiler, you don't know this until it happens, but definitely look out for similarities between the Theseus story and the Heracles story. Okay, why is that? Because this is going to be a story about the great hero of Athens, Theseus, okay, who ends up being king of Athens. Aegeus is the 9th king of Athens. There were 8 that preceded him. And what I used to do when I talked about this is I went one king after another. All you need to know, it's the usual story. This is with Rome as well. That from one king to another, the progression mainly had to do with the people demanding more and more power. And then finally, when you get up to the later kings, the people have a lot more power, and leading up to eventually, in the case of Athens, to democracy with quotes around it. Okay, so now, remember in the Perseus story, you have a king worried about having not kids in general, but rather male children, right? So don't forget that. You have a Theseus, he's worried about being able to ever have male children, so he goes and asks, and then the oracle tells him, your daughter's son is going to end up killing you. Right? And so he does all he can to prevent that from happening. In this case, Aegeus is not able to have any children. Obviously, that's a giant deal for the 9th king of Athens. And again, kind of symbolically, because 10 is a big number, just like 12, just like 3. There are certain numbers that are a big deal in the ancient world, and especially Greece. And in this case, how the heck is he going to have a legitimate king if he can't have a son? So he goes to the oracle and asks, am I going to ever have a son? And the oracle, as oracles often do, but in this case it's kind of interesting because the oracular, to be redundant, nature of the response, the cryptic, mysterious, unintelligible nature of the oracle is embedded in the very story. He gets an oracle and he doesn't understand it, but he memorizes it, and it says, do not loosen the bulging mouth of the wineskin until you have reached the height of Athens, lest you die of grief. So what that sounds like on a literal level is don't drink wine until you get to Athens. So you might think it means, oh, okay, everything, be cool, stay sober, and then go party when you finally get to Athens. So he's like, what the heck? Why the heck would an oracle tell me that? So what he does, like any smart king would do, is if he can't figure out what the oracle means, he goes to his buddy. And it just so happens, and this is going to be kind of a nice foreshadowing of our next guy, Jason, because there's a lot of travel involved in the Jason story as well, just as there was with Heracles, just as there was with Perseus. So we're seeing that the most important of the heroes in Greece involve the hero quest, traveling in order to achieve your goals. Okay, and that's no different here. So what he does is he can't understand the oracle, so he travels to his buddy Pythias in a place called Troezen, across part of the Mediterranean, to Athens. Okay, very symbolically, very importantly, things across from each other. Think about Crete with Egypt. Okay, there's some interesting kind of, water is not only important intrinsically in ancient Greece, but also as a place of transition, right? Think Hermes. Okay, so Aegeus sails across to his buddy Pythias, the king of Troezen, and the king of Troezen, Pythias, understands the oracle because he's a little smarter and a little more familiar with the type of language that oracles use. And what he does is he figures out that what the oracle meant was it was a sexual metaphor that I don't need to explain to you, adult. And so the idea here is that he must not have sex before he gets back to Athens. Why? Obviously, within the context of especially ancient Greek, what can only be called chauvinism, you want the Greek king to be purely Greek. Okay? So don't go getting someone from outside of Athens. You want the Athenian king to be from nowhere but Athens. Pythias does his best to prevent that from happening, to get his daughter, Aethra, to be the queen. And so he sneaks her in after getting Aegeus drunk one night while Aegeus is visiting Pythias and asking him what the oracle means. He gets Aegeus drunk, and in the middle of the night, Aethra goes in and seduces him, and he's still drunk, and they have sex. And that's the story behind the conception of Theseus. But there is one more element to the story that starts reminding you of the story of Heracles, yet at the same time contrasting with it. And that is, there's a god involved with the conception of the hero. But unlike the Heracles story, where you have a woman and her husband, and the husband going out of town temporarily, and Zeus coming into the picture, right? And then being one of two male figures who have sex with the woman. And, don't forget, twins, each of which has a different father. Now what you have is you have Poseidon also having sex with Aithra. But in this case, there are not two kids, but rather one. And what does that mean? It means that unlike Heracles, who is all Zeus-born, right? His father is 100% Zeus. In the case of Theseus, you have Poseidon being half his father. And the other guy, Aegeus, the other half. Okay, so this Theseus is going to end up being the product of the mother, Aithra, and two different fathers. Whereas Heracles had just one father, even though there were twins. Get that straight, you guys, because I got to admit, that took me a damn while to figure out. And believe me, the first year or two that I taught this class, I didn't linger on it very long because I was too scared of it. It was like really confusing if you let it be. So really try to figure that stuff out, okay, the difference, all right? So you have Heracles, he has just one father. Even though there were twins, one twin had one father, the other had the other. One was mortal, the other was immortal. In this case, you have one hero who has two different fathers. And because of that, guess what? Here's the fun part. Because of that, he doesn't have just one father. Now, the the divinity in the blood of this hero is roughly, because then there's other stuff in the lineage, whatever we'll call it, roughly half of what Heracles is. Oops. There's our first example of Theseus being Mini-Heracles. Got me? Okay, now that's going to later be borne out by the 6 labors instead of 12 that Theseus goes on. So what is going on here, you guys? Let's just kind of pause and ask ourselves, why is it in the interest of the Athenians to portray Theseus as half a Heracles? You know what it has to do with? It's all about, there's a good word for it. They used it all the time in the 60s. Solidarity. That's what it's about. It's about, hey, rest of Greece, who come to Athens every year and pay tribute and, pretty much make our city beautiful. Thank you for doing that. Don't worry. We worship the same dude you do. But we have our own as well. See what I mean? And so you have the story of this dude, and the story of this dude kind of further cements Athens as being the leader of the rest of the Greeks without getting rid of the common hero that they all worship together. Got me? So there's this walking and chewing gum at the same time idea. Okay, you got two things going on at once, and Athens was able to juggle them. Okay, they still worship Heracles unequivocally more than any other hero, even more than their own indigenous hero Theseus. Yet they have their own, and he's modeled on Heracles, but half a Heracles, not only in blood, but also in terms of being a hero. He's half as important because he has half as many labors. Okay. Now there's going to be another aspect to it that is really interesting as well, that we'll get to when we do. There's some real important details here to linger on, all right? I don't cry wolf with the names, so definitely get those names down. Pythias and Aithra in this case. And then Troezen is the place across from Athens. That's important. And you know what's beautiful? You guys already have it in your bones. You guys get it. You've internalized already the difference between Zeus and Poseidon when it comes to the worship of the gods. Let's be real here, right? There is a definite, and another time I'm using this fancy word, syllogism. A is to B as C is to D. Sometimes syllogisms are really powerful, and this is a good example of that. A is to B as C is to D. What is the A and B, and what's the C and the D? A and B is Heracles and Theseus, and then Zeus and Poseidon. Okay? Poseidon is to Zeus as Theseus as to Heracles in importance within their particular realms. Right? So, don't forget, Zeus won the sweepstakes with that lottery, being able to be the sky god. Poor Poseidon is kind of demoted to the earth level. Okay, that's another way of saying one above human beings, really, because he has to kind of linger in the same zone that Dionysus and Demeter do, right, with sea and charge of earthquakes, etc., whereas Zeus gets to be the sky god. And then let's not even talk about poor Hades. He's at the very bottom rung of that whole thing. Okay? So the symbolism of Poseidon being the father of Theseus, and not even completely the father of him, is very important here, right? Because it's not Zeus, but rather Poseidon that is the second most important to Zeus, the second most powerful of the Olympians after Zeus. He's the other bearded guy. He's the other guy that you always see bearded, just like Zeus is. And so that links them together in this sense of those with beards being older in aura, older in spirit. Obviously not really older because they were born around the same time, but older in the sense of wiser and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So the cliche of the long beard being, for wise men, that begins right into, it starts with the Greeks. So there's Theseus, two fathers, a mortal and immortal, and he's, what we already said. Okay, so now Aegeus finds out what happened, and he's all good about it. Aegeus knows what happened. Aegeus is having a lot of troubles in Athens, and he knows that one day he's going to need some help. He's getting older. He's going to need some help. He's overjoyed that he's going to have a son, despite what the oracle said, told him not to have one until he gets to Athens. He didn't, at this point, even know, because Pythias didn't tell him what he knew about the oracle based on his better ability at interpretation. Okay, so as far as Aegeus knows, all that happened is that he has a son that is going to be part mortal and part immortal. He knows he needs help eventually, and he knows that his son is going to at least potentially be a hero, because we already talked about how having divine blood doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a hero. And so what he does is he tells Aethra, I have to go back to Athens because, let me think, I'm the king. So yeah, of course, right? He needs to go back to Athens. But everybody's after me. Everybody's trying to usurp my throne. And hopefully it doesn't happen. If it doesn't, by the time that our son grows old enough to help me out in Athens, then tell him to go to Athens and help me out. What is the symbol of Theseus being old enough to be able to go to Athens and to exert his at least potential heroism? And that is that before he leaves from Troezen and goes back to Athens, he finds this giant boulder. Here's this boulder, Aethra. He put sandals and a sword under this giant boulder, put the boulder back on top of these things, and said, okay, Aethra, as soon as this infant is old enough to lift up this boulder and to take the sword and sandals out, get that sucker back to Athens and tell him that I need help, and we're going to kick some ass, and we're going to solve this whole succession problem from the ground up. And so it's all about succession. It's all about keeping the kingship in the family. And so the idea is that Theseus will eventually become the first of the Athenian kings of a new age. We're waiting a long time in the Theseus story for there to be an iconic moment. It didn't take us long with Heracles, right? It didn't take us long with Perseus. Boom. Zeus looks through the portal, shower of gold, millions of paintings. Finally, we get a moment like that in this story. When Theseus gets old enough and he lifts up the rock, lots and lots of artists throughout the ages, not only in the ancient world, depict this moment. Okay? So this is the moment, very famous, and I think to some extent we all have heard of this idea of lifting up the boulder. And that's, by the way, where sword and sandals epic, that phrase comes from when you talk about movies having to do with the ancient world, especially Rome, sword and sandals movies. Okay, so that happens, right? Now here's the next phase in the Theseus story. Theseus finds out from Aethra the whole thing, and then he lifts up the boulder, takes the sword and sandals off, and then Aethra says, okay, son, time to go to Athens. And she assumes that he's going to want to go back to Athens the way that Aegeus eventually came to Troezen, and that is by sea. But no. Theseus wants to go by land. You had Athens across the water from Troezen, but you also had land that you could travel along around the bend and then to finally get to Athens. Real important fact of the story. Theseus tells Aethra, no, I don't want to go by sea, I want to go by land. Why? He wants to emulate his hero Heracles. Big point, you guys. So not only is Theseus the Mini-Heracles, right? And not only is he contemporary with Heracles, but he's very aware of the exploits, the 12 Labors of Heracles, because that story goes around. And he wants to emulate him to the best of his ability by going by land so that he encounters some hardcore experiences. He wants to emulate Heracles by encountering the kinds of labors that Heracles encountered on his 12 labors. There's a big difference, right? Because when it came to Heracles, he did his 12 labors in order to satisfy the rigged by Hera oracle to go do the bidding of Eurystheus. Remember all that? In this case, it's for no other reason that I want to show the world that I'm as worthy of as my hero. It's kind of like Leonardo DiCaprio taking over for De Niro as being Scorsese's main actor. That's the idea here, okay? That emulation. But in this case, not that he knows it yet, the labors that he encounters are not going to be 12 in number, but 6, exactly half as many. And, interestingly, there are differences between the labors of Heracles and those of Theseus. Whereas the labors of Heracles were sprawled all over the place. You know, you had the lion, but at the same time you had diverting a river so that it cleans up fish from a stable. It's just all over the place, right? In the case of Theseus, the labors are a lot more concentrated in thematically. Okay? The one common thread throughout the Theseus labors is that he encounters one bully after another and makes him take a dose of his own medicine. And we all love that, right? Bullies are the scum of the earth. Even if we were, no, I wasn't, but even if one was a bully, hopefully you hate them now. I mean, bullies are the worst thing there is in the world. And I don't show my bias in a lot of things, but sorry, that's my take, okay? And this story is the most beautiful story of F bullies. Okay, it's just all about making bullies get a dose of their own medicine, which in this case means killing them all, one after another. Okay, so this really, the Theseus story is kind of the archetype for all those vigilante movies. Vigilante narratives really all come from the Theseus myth. Okay, not as much from Heracles, right? For the reason I just said. You have animals, you have crazy monsters, you have the doggy that you give food to. Heracles, it's all over the place. With Theseus, it's all about one a-hole after another that he kicks ass on in the same way that the bully kicks ass on others. Okay, so let's go quickly over those labors. And just as with Heracles, I focus on the ones that tend to have traction throughout history for whatever reason, by artists and the zeitgeist. Okay, some of them are less important than others. These are very primitive and simple stories. Just picture Theseus not going by sea back to Athens, but now walking around, trekking around that bend. And the first guy he encounters is Periphetes, the clubber. Clubber, not in the sense of going to a club and dancing and taking drugs or anything, but clubber in the sense of clubbing people over the head. Every once in a while you see that depicted. So he grabs the club from Periphetes and then hits Periphetes over the head and kills him. Now this is a really important one. This is maybe the second most important. The last one is the most important. Probably the second most important one is this guy Sinus. All right, so Sinus is kind of cool because in ancient Greek, Sinus means bending. It means bend. Just like a sine wave, a bent wave. Okay, same idea. Okay, so pine bender, what he does, he has this tree, and the traveler walks by, and he says, "Hey man, check out my tree." And he grabs him, puts him against the tree, pulls it back like a catapult, and then shoots him so far away that he dies. And so that's exactly what Theseus does back to him. Now, I use the word traveler to describe Theseus, and that's a very important point, you guys. And it's something you need to remember. Remember Zeus, we talked about one of his functions was as the protector of travelers, but more particularly protector of guests and hosts, okay, and strangers, right? And I told you guys that in ancient Greece, supposedly at least, if someone came to your door and was hungry, you're supposed to feed them. If they needed somewhere to sleep, you were supposed to give them a place to sleep. If both, you give them both. And if you don't, Zeus will punish you. Zeus will be pissed off, okay? So we need to put Theseus in that context. Here he is traveling. He's a traveler. And what is happening? He's encountering each of these 6 guys, and each of these 6 guys is doing what? Not being a bully only, but also being a bully to who? To a stranger, to someone who is disadvantaged because they don't have a home and they don't have equivalent of a refrigerator, say, that they can depend on, where there's food stored up. Okay? And so they have to depend, that's the idea here, depend on someone in order to eat and to have a place to sleep. And these guys are taking advantage of the traveler. That was the lowest form of being a bully you can imagine. Not only bullying someone in general, but also someone who was particularly vulnerable. Okay? So, needless to say, everybody was on the side of Theseus when it came to what he was accomplishing here, and that had a lot to do with why he was so beloved by the Athenians. It was important for him to be, because the Athenians needed to buy him as a Heracles worthy of being mentioned in the same sentence, hero. And the way to do that was to really emphasize kind of the thematic link between these different victims that Theseus took care of, and make sure that you hated them enough to where it was a great thing, according to everybody, what he did. If it were ambiguous, kind of like with Heracles, I mean, the lion, no one knows exactly what would have happened if the Nemean lion had continued going around. Maybe something, maybe not. The stables of Augeas, what if the crap just piled up to where, it was like to the sky? It would have stunk horribly, but it wouldn't have been as bad as these kinds of bullies going around and taking advantage of travelers. So there was that need to psychologize the labors in a way that hadn't been done with the Heracles stories. And to that extent, it's kind of an improvement propagandistically over the Heracles myth. Okay, so the Chromian sow, not important. It's kind of like the minor labors of Heracles, just not a giant deal. And Skiron, as kind of interesting as this one is, that's not a very famous one either. Skiron throwing people down a mountain. So obviously Theseus threw him down a mountain. So we have two more. The two most important are number 2 and 6. The Periphetes one is important, very important, just like the Nemean lion one is, because the club is one of the things that's associated with Theseus in recognizing him in the art that has to do with him. Okay, now the Minotaur will eventually be the thing that you associate most with him. But a close second is the club. And not only that, don't forget, when we contrasted the gods with the heroes, and we talked about how gods are normally associated with a tool, an instrument of some kind, equipment of some kind, heroes tend to be associated with their victims, the ones that they conquered in their hero quest. In the case of Theseus, there's an interesting kind of ambiguity there. Is it the club? Is it the Minotaur? Is it both? So there's a little more ambiguity in terms of recognizing Theseus. Okay, now the last one and most important, at least in the English-speaking world, mainly because of an adjective in the English language, Procrustean, that if you look up on Google News right now, within the last day, somewhere in the world, someone used Procrustean in some news article. Okay, so I'll tell you what the English word means after we get to the myth. And that is the really coolest one, too. This guy has a bed, and this is the most egregious abuse of the rule of hospitality that Zeus presides over. How much more obvious can you be in abusing travelers by saying, "Hey, tired guy, I got a bed for you, buddy. Come on and sleep in it." And then once the person lies in his bed and falls asleep, if he's too long for the bed, Procrustes cuts off the end of his legs to make him fit perfectly into the bed. If he's too short for it, he stretches him out. Either you lop off the part of the traveler who's too tall for the bed, or you stretch him out to make him exactly the right length for the bed if he's too short. And so Theseus does the same thing to Procrustes. Theseus gives him a taste of his own medicine. Okay, so the adjective in English I referred to is Procrustean. Procrustean, which means trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, trying to force something that doesn't belong, trying to fit it in where it doesn't belong. And that's the idea. So a Procrustean attempt to make peace between one country and another, for example, trying to fit them into this bed together in a way that is unrealistic because they hate each other so much. Or the Procrustean attempt to make someone like their mother when they really hate their mother. Okay, and that would be a Procrustean attempt to try to force that thing. Okay, so that's a relatively common adjective. You see it all over the place that comes directly from this myth. And that's the end. That's the labors of Theseus. Once he gets to Athens, he finds out about a certain thing going on there that Aegeus kind of took for granted, but that Theseus, after 3 years, finally could tolerate no longer. And it had to do with the Minotaur. Okay, so where the heck does the Minotaur come from? Very famous icon that you're all aware of. So now let's kind of lead up to where the Minotaur comes from. It has to do with the use of myth for propagandistic purposes. So remember with Narmer, we talked about and read how Narmer did what he could to come up with that Horus, Osiris, Seth creation myth, or at least to propagate it, who knows if he invented it or not, in order to achieve unification of North and South Egypt. Okay, there's something kind of similar going on with the Theseus myth, but also very different. So it's not exactly a duplication of the Narmer situation, but it should ring a bell. So what do I mean by that? First thing to know is, whereas Heracles was worshipped all over Greece, just as much as Zeus, Theseus was indigenous to one place only, and that is Athens. Okay, so Theseus is the indigenous Athenian hero. There were some problems there, because as time went on historically, Athens became more and more the dominant political, economic, and cultural center of ancient Greece. And so whoever's in power, place that is most powerful in Greece, in this case Athens, how is he going to convince everybody all over Greece that they all belong to the same nation, so that they'll all fight together, so that they'll all call themselves by the same name, especially when all of a sudden you, Athenians, have your own hero, right? It's not much of a team player, if you get my drift, because everywhere else, as far as heroes go, not gods and goddesses, because we already talked about how Corinth is Poseidon and, etc., Zeus and Olympia and whatever. As far as heroes go, Heracles was almost universally worshipped all over Greece. So there's a bunch of different Olympians that were worshipped, had temples devoted to them, etc., dedicated to them, and then pretty much Heracles all over the place. You don't hear much about Perseus worship. Okay, every once in a while you do. Not nearly as much as Heracles. And then Theseus comes along. So how do the Athenians, on the one hand, manage to, there's no other word for it really, I guess, create their own indigenous, unique to Athens hero, yet at the same time convince the rest of Greece that they haven't foregone worshiping Heracles? They're still on board with the Heracles worship. In other words, they're still on the Hellas team, still on the Greece team. Okay, how do they do that? It's kind of interesting. It's worth looking into. So keep that in the back of your mind as we get into the Theseus story. Notice how Minos, the first of the Minoan kings, which is another way of saying the very first of all Greek kings, how he's portrayed. Notice there's an arc, there's a character arc, there's a change in the characters. Think about the Helios creation myth, not so much. There is giant change in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and that's more relevant for our purposes, because that's a hero story. And so remember how Gilgamesh changed. That was the whole point to his story. And so we have change going on in the Theseus story as well, but not as much Theseus himself changes as the enemy of Theseus changes from good to bad. The key here is to get to the Minos story. It's a story of change, just like with Gilgamesh. He starts out kind of a cool dude, and then he becomes such a terrible guy that, and here's the takeaway, here's the key, to what effect? You portray Minos as such a terrible guy. He started as good and he became bad. Why? Because that is a story that deals with the reason for Athens taking over the leadership of all of Greece. So Minos is the very first king of Crete. So the island of Crete, as I already told you guys, was the southernmost of the Greek islands and the largest, and right between Egypt and Peloponnese in Greece, where Crete is. So kind of symbolic, because interestingly, between the east coast of the mainland of Greece and what's called Asia Minor, which is the westernmost area of the Persian Empire, right in the middle there is Delos, an island famous for two main things. Apollo and Artemis are from there, and the Delian League begins there. The Delian League I told you guys about, that had to do with Pericles and having to bring tribute to Athens each year. That's where the Delian League began, and then eventually it was moved to Athens. And the easy way to remember that Minos is the founder of Minoan civilization is, whoops, I just told you, Minoan Minos. Okay, Minoan civilization is named after the founder and first king of Minoan civilization. The story begins very simply, not with Minos thinking, hey, do I get to have any kids or not? No. It begins with Minos looking around at how beautiful everything is on the island of Crete, and you'll be able to relate to that if you visit the island of Crete. Extremely beautiful, surrounded by trees and the sea and perfect weather, kind of like San Diego, very much like it. And he's looking around and he's scared that things are so damn good. And so he prays to the gods for a sign that not only are things as good as he thinks they are, but that he truly is blessed. Please, gods, give me a sign. And Poseidon, the father, kind of Theseus, interesting. Theseus is coming into the picture later. They call that foreshadowing, right? Poseidon sends to Minos a white bull from the sea. Now the question is, why is it a bull? That archaeologists have gotten a little bit of insight into when you look at the ruins of Knossos, the main cultural center of Crete in the Minoan period. Lots and lots of bull iconography. We can't read the writing that they left behind, so we have to rely just about entirely on physical remains, on visual remains, in order to interpret who these people were, which is kind of fascinating. Okay, so bulls all over the place. That's kind of the bottom line here. On the vases, on the walls, wall paintings, statues, bull, bull, bull. Nobody knows why, and it's fascinating. They're really an enigma for us. So this white bull from the sea runs up to Minos, and Minos admires this bull and is so overwhelmed by the beauty of this bull that instead of doing what Poseidon, according to the ancient Greeks, it was kind of understood, what Poseidon wanted Minos to do, which was right away sacrifice it to Poseidon, kill it, in order to say thank you for sending it, Poseidon. Instead of doing that, he was so overwhelmed by the beauty of this bull that he refused to sacrifice it, even though all the town people told him to do it, knowing that Poseidon would be pissed off that he didn't pay proper worship to Poseidon. And as you can guess, and it's kind of a foreshadowing, because when we get to the Odyssey, you'll see how pissed off Poseidon can get about things. Poseidon got extremely angry with Minos, and he punished him. So Minos is expected to sacrifice the bull. How do we know that? Because in an ancient Greek context, when a god sends you something like that, it's an omen. And it means, thank you, now I'm going to pray to you, and thank you for sending it to me. Well, Minos decides not to do that. Why? Because it's too beautiful. He can't handle the idea of killing this beautiful animal. So that is portrayed as a negative check on the character of Minos when it comes to ancient Greek religion and how the gods perceive Minos. But from the standpoint of the Athenians telling the story, it was portrayed as showing that he has a heart, as showing that he started out as a good guy. I told you guys that characterologically, this story goes with showing how a king went from good to bad. And so this, according to the Athenians, was a sign of him being a good guy and not wanting to kill. Not wanting to kill the bull. So that was one way to demonstrate that. Okay, there's going to be others of those little signs that show that at first Minos was a good guy, and then there's going to be signs that he became a bad guy, and therefore worthy of having his throne usurped. Now, the biggest reason the Athenians wanted to portray him as a good guy, other than wanting to portray him as a bad guy later, is that in Athens you had kings at the very beginning as well. And so you don't want to get across the idea that because Minos is a king, he's a bad guy. It's not by virtue of being a king that he becomes bad. It's because of his character. So Poseidon's pissed off. And now we get into the weird stuff. Poseidon wants to punish Minos, and the way he does it is he gets his wife, the queen, Pasiphae. Queen Pasiphae is the one that Poseidon directly punishes and indirectly punishes Minos by having her fall in lust with the bull. This magical creature that Minos refused to kill. And now Poseidon says, oh, you think that bull is so beautiful, do you? Well, guess what? Pasiphae's also going to think so. But not really just beautiful, but also something else. And so what Pasiphae does, because now, don't forget Heracles with Ate being thrown into his head and making him so crazy he goes killing his family. Okay, that's how powerful Ate is. So now, she has Ate in her head, kind of a link to the Heracles story, but she's not going to go killing anybody. She's going to go doing all she can to, how do we put it nicely, have her way with the bull. Or let the bull have his way with her. And so what does she do? She goes to the most famous of the craftsmen on our level, on the human level, and that is Daedalus. And Daedalus creates a hollow facsimile of a cow for her to get inside of, and there's no gentle way to put this, and offer herself to the cow, to the bull. I'm not making this stuff up. There's Daedalus, kind of the Hephaestus of the earthly level. She gets inside, she looks really happy, but she also looks kind of hypnotized by Ate, you see that? And that's probably Daedalus helping her out. He looks like way too happy. Something's weird about this. This is a strange look. Never mind, let's get... Now that's... Okay. Sorry. Okay. So what happens is depicted by one of the most famous artists of all time. Who's this?
Picasso.
This is Picasso. Picasso got insane about the bull, and then later about the Minotaur. Okay. Spoiler: Minotaur's coming up. Okay. So the product, the offspring of this union, was the Minotaur. So that's where the Minotaur comes from. Now that's going to be the Medusa for Theseus. That's going to be the Nemean lion for Theseus. Every hero has to have their iconic association. And I already pointed out to you guys, Zeus had the thunderbolt, Poseidon has the trident, you have these weapons that are associated with them, right? And sometimes animals. But when it comes to a hero, the one thing they all have in common, except Jason is a little weird, we'll get to him later, is that they're associated not with a weapon, not with a thing, not with an animal, but with their conquest, with the creature, the monstrous creature that they conquer. Okay? So Pasiphae seduces the bull, and this is what happens, and the offspring is the Minotaur, which literally, in ancient Greek, means the bull of Minos. So Minoan civilization is named after Minos, and so is the Minotaur. Now, we get to the second detail about Minos that supposedly, according to the Athenians, illustrated his heart, and that he was a decent guy at the very beginning. Okay? And that is that once this horrible creature is born, all of the Minoans are saying, hey, kill it, kill it, kill it, get it out of this world. It's a disgusting thing. And Minos just can't get himself to do it because it's his wife's kid. So there's two instances where Minos refuses to kill. And so he has a heart, is the message there at the very beginning. Now that's going to change. Get ready. So now we make the transition. Instead of killing the Minotaur, he does what he considers to be more humane, and that is to lock him up. So he gets the same guy who made the fake cow, Daedalus, to make him a labyrinth and to imprison the Minotaur inside the labyrinth. Archaeologists interpret the design of the labyrinth to reflect the extremely elaborate nature of the palace system in Knossos. And get ready, here's the artist's reconstruction that is real accurate as far as what archaeologists have, in conjunction with art historians, have come up with what it looked like. So kind of, the Mall of America? I don't know what you compare that to, but pretty amazing stuff. All right, so the Minotaur's locked up. So now we're at the tail end, finally, of the Theseus story. We're going to have to do two things at the end of this story. We're going to have to make Minos an asshole, and we're going to have to make Theseus the hero of the day. How are we going to do it? As almost always in any of these kinds of stories, an event occurs that changes the game. Minos' son, don't worry about his name, there's enough names, aren't there? Goes over to Athens to partake in some kind of athletic contest, and then he is killed, and usually it's by some discus that hits the head of Minos' son. And from that point on, Minos is the enemy of Athens. Get it? So now what? So what is he going to do in response to his son being killed? Now is when he shows, according to the Athenians, his really true nature. After all that being nice to the cow and the Minotaur BS. And what is that going to be? Minos orders the Athenians to send 7 boys and 7 girls to Crete to be thrown into the labyrinth every year in order to be killed and eaten by the Minotaur. Now we put the two stories together. And remember the stuff we said about Theseus returning by land to Athens? Think of him as being there, and think of 3 years going by. That's an enigma. Nobody knows why, but 3 years went by with Theseus sitting by and letting that happen. Okay? I have no explanation. Nobody does. And it pisses a lot of people off who want logic to these stories. Why didn't Theseus right away say, screw you, I'm going to war with you? No, for 3 years this happened. 7 boys and 7 girls were sent over to Crete in order for them to be sacrificed to the Minotaurs, what it really came down to. And then after the 3rd year, Theseus says, I'm going with the kids this time, and I'm kicking some ass. So he does. Goes over there, gets up to the entrance of the labyrinth, and realizes, wait a minute, first of all, how the heck am I going to find this creature? And second of all, after killing it, then how the hell do I get back out? Well, just so happens that Minos has a daughter named Ariadne, and she famously helps him out by giving him the idea, okay, female character, being the genius of the get ready for this. There's more paradox for you as we get deeper into the semester. We're going to see a lot of instances of female characters in fiction being geniuses within a society where they're not even allowed to go to the theater to watch them be depicted that way. Okay, so we got the weird paradoxes going on here. Okay, so Ariadne comes up with the brilliant idea of giving Theseus a spool of yarn and telling him to unfurl it as he walks looking for the Minotaur, kill the Minotaur. You're on your own with that one. And then once you're done, just follow the yarn back. And he does it. And because of her, he gets back. And yeah, along the way, they fall in love. And yeah, she becomes the queen. And yeah, from that point on, Theseus becomes the hero of Athens. And Athens becomes the new kid in town when it comes to who's in charge around Greek waters and lands. So this is a etiological myth. A myth tells you how something comes about, the cause of something. It's called etiological. And so it's an etiological myth, number one, for how Minoan civilization became a backwater and no longer in charge of things because of the horribleness of Minos. And number two, how Athens became the new kid in town, and it's because of the greatness of Theseus.